Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Yonit Arthur. You are on the Steady Coach, and in today's unedited video, as part of the Ask Dr. Yo series, I'm going to answer probably one of the most common questions that I get asked in our membership community. And I'm sure many of you here on my channel have been wanting to ask this question as well. Why is my anxiety getting worse during my chronic dizziness recovery? This often happens when people's symptoms get better, which really throws them off. They say, wow, this stuff is really working, but now why are my symptoms suddenly better? And now my anxiety is so much worse. So I'm going to give you 4 reasons why this happens today. But first, just normalizing this and saying, it happens to many people. It does not happen to everyone. So I'm not saying you should expect this during your recovery process, but if it does happen, take heart, take note. This is what I consider to be a normal part of that process. And for more information on why symptoms change in general, you probably want to check out my video on symptom drift. That also explains a little more in depth why vestibular symptoms and other body symptoms tend to change during recovery. But this one is very specific to anxiety. So, the first reason why anxiety can often get worse when your symptoms go down and you're actually recovering is that your brain likes routine. Remember, our brains are prediction machines. Our brains like knowing what to predict, they like their expectations being met. And I've often said this, but it may be a little hard to hear this. Your brain really doesn't care about your comfort, it cares about your survival. So, if your brain notices that its predictions are repeatedly wrong, AKA you're a lot less dizzy than you were and you're doing more things, your brain may ramp up the anxiety to let you know that you may be potentially in danger. You're now out of the realm of its normal predictions as you're getting better from this dizziness sensation issue that you've had for a while. And that alone can make your brain feel discomfort and produce anxiety symptoms. If that's the case, great news. There's not really a whole lot you need to do other than weather this, which is exactly why I'm making this video. Because when you hear that this is normal and this is your brain just adjusting to new predictions and new routine, there's really, again, nothing special you have to do. Just know it will pass. This is temporary. Your brain will get used to the new status quo and everything will be just fine. The second reason why anxiety symptoms often ramp up during chronic dizziness recovery is that your symptoms have probably been extremely distressing to you for a while. And as your symptoms start to go down, or as you start to lose your fear of symptoms, your brain is no longer as distracted from the fact that you were actually in fight or flight a lot of the time. So, if you're new to my channel and you have no idea what fight or flight has to do with dizziness, please watch my basics video. I will link to that in the video description. Or if you're listening to this as a podcast, it will also be linked to in the description of the podcast. You'll really want to watch that. It will help you make sense of what I'm about to say. So, reminder, fight or flight or danger mode, your brain basically predicting that something terrible is going to happen to you, is at the root of chronic dizziness symptoms that are medically unexplained. So that's been there the whole time. Your brain has been in danger mode this whole time. But often people don't notice it because they're so preoccupied. Their attention is so focused on these awful dizziness symptoms, they don't even notice the symptoms of anxiety in their bodies. So when that distraction, not that dizziness is a distraction, but when those distracting symptoms start to go down, or you're less preoccupied with fear of symptoms, suddenly your brain notices danger mode, anxiety a lot more. So again, normal process here. And similar to number one, there's not a whole lot of extra stuff you need to do if you're already getting to this point. Again, this is what I consider to be progress, as much as it's very unpleasant and I would rather it not happen to any of you. But knowing that this is what's actually happening, that the anxiety and these fight or flight symptoms were probably already occurring, your brain just wasn't focusing attention on them, that is really useful to know. And by the way, also just normalizing the fact that this is how our brain operates all the time. You're already getting a million different pieces of information from the world around you and from your sensory systems. Your brain's job is to figure out where to focus its attention. So it's not like you were specifically focusing your attention on your dizziness symptoms or on anything else. Your brain is making decisions about what to focus its attention on. And if your brain was focusing attentions on dizziness because they were like the red alert high priority, and now they're not the red alert high priority anymore, you're more likely to notice those danger mode symptoms. And as you continue to practice the techniques we talk about on the channel and reduce danger mode, that will pass as well. The third reason why anxiety gets worse sometimes during chronic dizziness recovery, when your symptoms go down, or when you're starting to lose your fear of symptoms, is that emotions may be surfacing. So we already know, we've already talked about the fact that many of you had emotional distress that put your brain into danger mode in the first place. And you can kind of think of that like the bottom of the iceberg, and then the symptoms at the very top of the iceberg, and then the fight or flight response kind of in the middle of the iceberg. Okay. So what's happening is the symptoms are really what you see. Close to underneath the symptoms, there's this fight or flight response. But what's actually leading to the fight or flight response in many cases is emotional distress. And this emotional distress, in many cases, is emotional distress that had nothing to do with the dizziness symptoms at all. It often predated dizziness symptoms. It could have to do with a long buildup of stress just from stressful life events, or it could be a buildup from traumatic experiences that you had earlier in your life or more recently. It can just be, again, cumulative or a big bad event. It can be any of those things. So what ends up happening is, as we are no longer distracted by or fearful of symptoms, or the symptoms start to go away, sometimes what happens is you start to get closer to those emotions, and your brain takes those emotions, the fact that the emotions are now kind of more visible. If you're looking down from the top, you're more aware of them. It takes that as a renewed source of threat. So we've talked about this in some previous videos. I believe in my video on emotions, we may have talked about this, or my video on relationships, we may have talked about this. But we learn at certain points in our lives that some emotions can be threatening. So many people, for example, are told when they're children, big girls or big boys don't cry, for example. We get messages like that from our parents, our caregivers, society. Again, sometimes it's not an obvious thing. We just get these subtle messages that some emotions are bad or not welcome. And when those emotions start to surface, if that's what's kind of here underneath everything as a source of emotional distress for you that's unresolved, your brain is going to start to notice them. Again, it's no longer focused on symptoms anymore. It's going to start to notice those emotions, and that's going to ramp up your fight or flight response, because your brain has learned at some point in your life that those emotions, are not safe to experience. So as emotions start to surface, that can also increase anxiety. Now, another really important and related note here is that sometimes the emotion is not one of these emotional distress or stressful situations that led to chronic symptoms in the first place. It can also be grief over the loss of the time that you've had dealing with chronic symptoms. So one of the I guess more challenging components of recovery for some people, especially people who've had this for a while, is that they've been suffering for months or years or sometimes even decades. And when they realize, wow, oh my gosh, this is something I can get better from. I can cope with these things. I can deal with these things. I can feel my feelings. I can manage my intrusive thoughts, or whatever techniques they're using. They can sometimes feel shame that they didn't find this sooner, or that it was somehow their fault that this happened, or B, feel tremendous grief over the suffering and the loss of time. And that emotion also starts to surface. And if you received messages at some point in your life that grief wasn't an acceptable emotion to feel fully, which, by the way, I guess applies really to most of us in Western society. Open expressions of grief are not very welcome in Western society. Your brain may be responding to that emotion with alarm. So, what do you do about this? If it's emotional distress, emotions, grief surfacing, this is where you're really going to put some of the emotional expression tools into practice. So, for many of you, if you're doing journaling already, this is a time to really spend some time doing emotionally focused journaling. I talk about this in the free course. If you haven't done it or you haven't done it recently, you can take another look at step 5, and there will be a major update to the course in 2024. So, if you're watching this video past that point, again, the course will talk about what emotionally focused journaling and emotionally focused work look like. But this is a time to actually move toward the fire. So move toward the emotions, because when you do that, even if you're not sure exactly what it is that set your brain off, even if you're not sure exactly if it's grief or stress from before the events, by moving toward emotions in general, you're giving your brain the message that emotions are safe. That's going to turn down the danger mode response. That's going to turn down that fight or flight response in response to emotions. So you don't have to figure out the exact issue that is being surfaced right now. You need to give your brain a general sense of safety in response to emotions. So for more about this, please watch the video on emotions. I will put that in the video description as well. And the fourth and final reason why anxiety often gets worse during chronic dizziness recovery, especially when symptoms go down or when symptoms are no longer as scary to you, is that you're having emotional distress over getting better. And hear me out on this. If this doesn't apply to you, please feel free to say, cool, I got what I needed out of this video, and just turn it off. But I've heard this from enough people that I think it's really important to speak about it. Kind of ties into what we were talking about in the first reason. The brain likes familiarity, but we can get kind of enmeshed in this state of trying to heal, trying to figure out how to get better, trying to take care of ourselves. And then when we reach some of those points where it's actually working and we're starting to feel better, for again, whether that's symptom relief or just reduction in fear, it can feel a little threatening, actually. So, one of the most interesting things that I see, and again, not putting this on any of you, if this doesn't apply to you, feel free to not have it apply to you. But symptoms are often playing some kind of useful role in someone's life. Again, not saying it's for everyone. And you can tell me in the comments, I totally get what you're saying. The symptoms were not useful to me at all. But even for people who hate every symptom with every last ounce of his or her being, the symptoms usually have some kind of unexpected, albeit very small and totally disproportional, not what you want, benefit to the person. And here are some examples. Okay. So I'm not saying that you want symptoms. So I want to be super, super clear about this. I'm not saying you want symptoms. What I'm saying is when symptoms suck and you have symptoms, sometimes little small good things come out of that. And we really want to know if that is actually happening for you, because that can be a clue as to what might be holding you back from kind of embracing this recovery process. And when I say embracing the recovery process, I mean not feeling a lot of anxiety as things get better, right? So, some examples of things that I've heard from clients to kind of give you some ideas. One of my clients told me that one of the tiny little good things that totally wasn't worth it, but came out of the dizziness anyway, was that she didn't have to say no to people anymore because she could always blame the symptoms. So rather than have to have an uncomfortable conversation and say, actually, I don't like you, or I don't want to go to your birthday party, she could just say, oh, I'm just not feeling well today. And no one would question her. Okay. Another thing that I've heard from people, one person told me that if he didn't have symptoms anymore, then he would have to go back to being perfect at everything, right? So the symptoms, in an unexpected and weird and not worthwhile way, were giving him permission to not be perfect anymore. So again, these are just two examples from clients. So what I often ask people to do, and I know this is an exercise that some of you may not be ready for. So again, if you're new to symptoms and feeling totally dysregulated and like this thing needs to go away right now, there's nothing good about this, please know I respect you. And I'm not saying that chronic dizziness is good, but it can be super helpful to kind of just think creatively and say, What unexpected, even very small, good things does the dizziness give me right now? And when you do that, when you're willing to kind of list those down, you can list all the cons of having dizziness and you'll see the list is like this long and the benefits are like this. But when you see some of those good things, often those things tell you why getting better may be anxiety provoking. So for my two clients that I just mentioned, she had a hard time saying no. She had a hard time saying no. She had a hard time setting boundaries. And that was something she needed to work on in order to fully recover. For the second client I mentioned, he was a big perfectionist and he drove himself really, really hard and stressed himself out over every small detail. And he needed to stop doing that in order to recover from chronic dizziness. So, again, just some thoughts for you on this. Regardless of whether that exercise is something you feel you can do right now, though, it's really a good idea to just kind of think about what emotional distress you might have about resuming a normal life. And that's a question I think anyone can ask him or herself. So I hope this was a helpful video for you and more thoroughly explains why anxiety can sometimes really flare up while people are getting better. Questions and comments, please drop them below. If you're listening to this as a podcast, please come join the conversation on YouTube. It's super fun and interesting to connect to people in the comment section. And as always, you can like, you can share, you could subscribe to my channel. And if you're listening to this as a podcast, you can subscribe or leave me a 5-star review. All of these things help me reach more people. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.